An American captain stood in the mud of Phuoc province, staring at the men before him. He laughed. Not a chuckle, a full, mocking laugh that echoed across the firebase perimeter. "You look like schoolgirls," he said, gesturing at their short shorts and floppy jungle hats. The Australians didn't respond. They didn't need to. Within 6 months, those same schoolgirls would achieve kill ratios that defied every principle of modern warfare. While American units fired 50,000 rounds to kill a single enemy, these men would average 1 bullet for every 1.3 kills. You think you know what elite warfare looks like? You're wrong. This isn't about technology. It isn't about firepower. This is about something the Pentagon didn't understand, couldn't quantify, and ultimately refused to believe until the body counts became impossible to ignore. What made these soldiers so lethal that enemy commanders issued orders to avoid them at all costs? Why did the North Vietnamese call them the phantoms who smell of eucalyptus? And why, after achieving the impossible, were they withdrawn and their methods buried for decades? Stay until the end, because what happened in those jungles would challenge everything the world's most powerful military believed about war itself. The date was February 1966. The place was Nui Dat, a former rubber plantation 60 kilometers east of Saigon that still smelled of latex and rotting vegetation. The Australian task force had just arrived in Vietnam, and the Americans were not impressed. Major General William Dupuy, commander of the 1st Infantry Division, watched through binoculars as the Australians established their base. No bulldozers, no concrete bunkers, no massive firebase with artillery batteries arranged in perfect geometric patterns. Instead, small teams of men moved through the rubber trees like they were reading the landscape, choosing positions based on terrain features the American engineers had dismissed as tactically irrelevant. "They're setting up like it's 1915, Dupuy told his aide. He wasn't entirely wrong, but he wasn't right either. The Australian soldiers, unpacking their gear, that morning represented something the American military machine had forgotten. In its rush toward mechanization and overwhelming firepower, they were the inheritors of a military tradition forged in the worst place on earth, Gallipoli, the Western Front, the jungles of New Guinea, the frozen hills of Korea. Every one of them had been trained in a doctrine that assumed resources would always be scarce, that firepower would always be limited, that survival depended on skill rather than superiority. They didn't think like Americans. They couldn't afford to. Australia had never had the population or industrial capacity to win wars through attrition. They had learned, over 50 years of brutal conflicts, to win by being better man for man, shot for shot, decision for decision. The SAS squadron that arrived 3 months later took this philosophy to its absolute extreme. These were not regular infantry. These were men selected from a pool that had already been culled twice first to get into the Australian Army, then to survive selection for airborne or commando units, and finally to pass the SAS selection course, a psychological and physical crucible that broke 70% of candidates. The men who emerged from this process shared certain characteristics that military psychologists would later struggle to quantify. They were comfortable with isolation. They trusted their own judgment over official intelligence. They could read terrain and vegetation like a farmer reads soil. And they had something the Americans, with all their helicopters and artillery support, had forgotten how to develop: patience. The American captain who mocked their appearance in February had never seen men like this. His own training had emphasized speed, aggression, and the aggressive application of firepower. He had been taught that the answer to contact was to call in artillery, to suppress the enemy with overwhelming fire, to use American industrial might to simply erase problems from the map. It was a doctrine that made sense for a superpower. It was a doctrine built on the assumption that America would always have more bullets, more bombs, more soldiers, more of everything. The Australians had been trained under the opposite assumption. Every bullet mattered. Every movement had to have a purpose. Noise was the enemy. Patience was a weapon. The contrast became apparent during the first joint operation in April. 1966. An American mechanized infantry company and an Australian SAS patrol were assigned to search the same area of the Hobyo Woods, a known Viet Cong staging area 30 kilometers northwest of Saigon. The American approach was textbook. 12 M113 armored personnel carriers crashed through the jungle at first light. Infantry dismounting in formation, movement coordinated by radio chatter that could be heard half a kilometer away. They found nothing. 3 hours later, a 4-man Australian patrol entered the same area. They moved in silence, following game trails, stopping every few minutes to listen. Within an hour, they had located a Viet Cong platoon preparing to ambush the Americans. The SAS team leader made a decision that would have been unthinkable to his American counterparts. He didn't call it in. He didn't request artillery. He didn't even radio his own headquarters. He simply positioned his 4 men in a kill zone and waited for the enemy to move. When the Viet Cong squad began their approach march toward the American position, the Australians opened fire. 17 seconds. 48 rounds. 14 confirmed kills. The remaining enemy melted into the jungle before the echo of gunfire faded. By the time American helicopters arrived 20 minutes later, the SAS team had already withdrawn, leaving only bodies and spent brass. The American battalion commander was furious. "You can't just engage the enemy without coordinating," he shouted during the debrief. "You could have compromised our entire operation." The Australian captain listened politely, then asked a single question. "How many did you get?" Silence. The American operation, with its 12 armored vehicles, 140 soldiers, and supporting artillery, had resulted in 0 enemy casualties and the expenditure of approximately 8,000 rounds of ammunition. 4 Australians, armed with self-loading rifles and nothing else, had killed 14 enemy soldiers with less ammunition than a single American squad carried. The mathematics were beginning to tell a story that contradicted everything the Pentagon believed about modern warfare. But this single engagement was just a data point. What happened over the next 2 years would become a statistical impossibility that military analysts would argue about for decades. The Australian SAS didn't just achieve good results. They achieved results that violated the fundamental assumptions of attrition warfare. In 1966, the average American infantry battalion expended 52,000 rounds of small arms, ammunition per confirmed enemy kill. The Australians averaged 1.4 rounds per kill. In 1967, the numbers became even more skewed. As American firepower increased, more artillery, more airstrikes, more ammunition, their ammunition expenditure per kill rose to 65,000 rounds. The Australian SAS ratio improved to 1.3 rounds per kill. This wasn't a marginal difference. This was a fundamental challenge to modern military doctrine. The Pentagon couldn't ignore it, but they couldn't accept it either. Brigadier General William Knowlton, assigned to study Allied combat effectiveness, visited the Australian task force in August 1967. He wanted to understand what made them different. He expected to find some tactical innovation, some new technique that could be incorporated into American training. What he found instead was something that couldn't be replicated by doctrine. He watched an SAS patrol prepare for a 5-day reconnaissance mission. No radio chatter, no last-minute equipment checks, no nervous energy. Just 4 men methodically preparing gear they had already inspected 3 times, moving with the unconscious coordination of a team that had trained together for 18 months. How do you maintain radio silence for 5 days? Knowlton asked the patrol commander. We don't maintain it, sir, the Australian lieutenant replied. We just don't use the radio unless we have something worth saying. Knowlton didn't understand. American doctrine required radio checks every 4 hours. Communication was considered essential for coordination. What if you get in trouble? He asked. The Australian smiled. Then we get ourselves out of trouble, sir. That's what we're trained for. This philosophy, self-reliance to the point of isolation, was so foreign to American military culture that it might as well have been from another planet. American soldiers were trained to be part of a system, components in a massive machine where firepower, logistics, and communication created overwhelming combat power. Australian SAS soldiers were trained to be the system. Each 4-man patrol operated as an independent unit capable of intelligence gathering, target selection, engagement decisions, and extraction without higher approval. They didn't wait for orders. They didn't request permission to fire. They made decisions based on their assessment of the situation, and they lived or died by the quality of those decisions. This required a completely different selection process, a completely different training philosophy, and most importantly, a completely different relationship between commanders and subordinates. American officers controlled their units through detailed orders and constant communication. Australian SAS commanders controlled their teams by selecting men they trusted, training them to standard, and then leaving them alone. It was a system built on trust rather than hierarchy, on competence rather than compliance. And it produced results that seemed impossible. In October 1967, a single 6-man SAS patrol operating in Phuoc 2 province engaged a North Vietnamese army, company approximately 90 soldiers that had ambushed an Australian infantry patrol. The mathematics should have been simple. 6 men against 90. The SAS team should have withdrawn, called for support, and let artillery do the work. Instead, they attacked. Using terrain, surprise, and precision fire, they killed 37 enemy soldiers in 11 minutes. The rest fled. The Australian patrol suffered 1 wound. They had fired approximately 200 rounds. That's 5.4 rounds per kill, against a numerically superior force, in a meeting engagement where the enemy had tactical advantage. American combat analysts examined the after-action report 3 times, looking for errors. There were none. The engagement had happened exactly as reported. But numbers alone don't explain why the North Vietnamese began circulating warnings about the quiet ones, or why captured documents from 1968 included specific orders to avoid contact with Australian patrols. Fear doesn't come from casualty ratios. Fear comes from unpredictability, from facing an enemy who violates your assumptions about how warfare works. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army had adapted to American tactics. They understood that American units were noisy, that they relied on helicopters, that they would call artillery at first contact, that officers made decisions and radiomen passed orders. This understanding created opportunities. You could hear American patrols coming. You could set ambushes near landing zones. You could break contact and withdraw during the 20-minute window between first contact and artillery impact. You could predict their behavior because it followed doctrine, and doctrine was consistent. The Australians were not consistent. They were quiet when you expected noise, aggressive when you expected caution, patient when you expected speed. They didn't follow radio schedules you could track. They didn't establish patrol patterns you could anticipate. They didn't call artillery that would give you time to withdraw. They just appeared, killed your men with surgical precision, and vanished before you could respond. This unpredictability was more terrifying than American firepower because it couldn't be countered with tactics. You couldn't hide from an enemy that tracked you through a jungle you thought was impenetrable. You couldn't ambush an enemy that moved through terrain you considered impassable. You couldn't outlast an enemy that could survive on a handful of rice and whatever they could forage. Remaining in the field for weeks at a time, the symbolic object it came to represent, Australian effectiveness, wasn't a weapon or piece of equipment. It was something far more mundane, the tea bag. Every Australian patrol carried tea. Not coffee, not American instant rations, but proper black tea. They would brew it in the middle of the jungle, during operations, using a small hexamine stove that produced almost no smoke and could be hidden behind a tree root. American soldiers thought it was insane. You're making tea during a combat operation? A Marine lieutenant asked an SAS sergeant in December 1967. Of course, the Australian replied. Why wouldn't we? To Americans, who had been trained to eat cold rations during field operations to avoid detection, the idea of brewing tea seemed like reckless disregard for security. To the Australians, it represented something deeper. It was a statement. We are so comfortable in this environment, so confident in our fieldcraft, so certain of our perimeter security, that we can stop and have a cup of tea whenever we want. It was psychological warfare against their own stress, a ritual that reminded them they were professionals doing a job, not frightened soldiers hiding in the jungle. And it was a message to anyone watching. We own this ground, but beyond the symbolism, beyond the impressive kill ratios and the growing legend, there was something more fundamental happening in those Australian patrols. They were demonstrating a truth that the American military establishment didn't want to acknowledge, that in certain types of warfare, quality mattered more than quantity, that skill could overcome firepower, that a small number of supremely competent soldiers could achieve more than a large number of adequately trained ones. This was heresy to the Pentagon. The entire American military-industrial complex was built on the assumption that technology and mass production would decide wars. If you needed to kill more enemies, you built more bombers, trained more soldiers, and fired more artillery. The Australian SAS represented a competing theory that warfare was fundamentally about human decision-making, about the quality of training and the caliber of individual soldiers, about adaptation and fieldcraft and the accumulated wisdom of hard experience. This was a theory that couldn't be mass-produced. It couldn't be solved with bigger budgets or more equipment. It required something that took time, that required brutal selection standards, that accepted high failure rates to get the exceptional individuals who could perform at this level. The American captain, who had mocked that Australians in February, watched them return from a patrol in November. They had been in the field for 17 days, living on minimal rations, moving through terrain American units avoided, gathering intelligence that would lead to the disruption of an entire North Vietnamese supply network. They looked exactly like they had when they left, unhurried, professional, completely unimpressed with themselves. The captain didn't laugh this time. He had seen the intelligence reports. He had seen the body counts. He had heard the radio intercepts of enemy communications, specifically warning units to avoid areas where Australians operated. He walked over to the patrol leader, a sergeant who looked more like a schoolteacher than a soldier. "How do you do it?" he asked. The Australian sergeant thought for a moment. "We don't try to fight their war, mate," he said. "We make them fight ours." That was the key. American doctrine assumed you could impose your will on the enemy through superior firepower. You could force them to fight on your terms by dominating the battlefield with artillery, airstrikes, and mechanized infantry. The Australians understood something different. They understood that in guerrilla warfare, the side that chooses when and where to fight has the advantage. So they made themselves into the side that chose. They became the hunters rather than the hunted. the transformation in American attitudes happened slowly, patrol by patrol, briefing by briefing, as the evidence became impossible to dismiss. By mid-1968, American commanders who had initially dismissed the Australians as unprofessional or reckless were requesting their assistance for high-priority operations. Special Forces teams, who should have been the American equivalent of the SAS, began asking to observe Australian training and tactics. The mythology grew. Stories circulated about Australian patrols that had tracked enemy units for days, about ambushes so perfectly planned that entire enemy squads were eliminated before they could fire a shot, about soldiers who could smell the enemy's cooking fires from a kilometer away and identify the unit by the type of rice they were preparing. Some of these stories were exaggerated. Some were understatements. In March 1968, an Australian patrol tracked a North Vietnamese reconnaissance team for 67 hours, mapping their route, identifying their surveillance positions, and determining their reporting schedule. When they finally engaged, it was at a moment of perfect disadvantage for the enemy crossing a stream, weapons across their backs, completely focused on footing rather than security. 8 enemy soldiers, 23 seconds, 12 rounds fired, 8 kills. The patrol leader noted in his report that they had waited an additional 30 minutes after the engagement to ensure no other enemy forces were in the area before withdrawing. This level of patience, of tactical discipline, of absolute confidence in their ability to control the engagement was something American units simply didn't possess. It couldn't be taught in a 6-week training course. It came from selection, from culture, from a military tradition that valued individual excellence over systemic efficiency. The North Vietnamese understood what they were facing long before the Americans appreciated what they had. Captured documents from 1968 included remarkably detailed intelligence on Australian tactics, describing their patrol techniques, their ambush methods, their use of terrain. But understanding an enemy's tactics and countering them are different things. The documents recommended avoiding contact with Australian units, operating outside areas where they were known to patrol, and treating any sign of their presence at Broken Branch, a bootprint, disturbed vegetation, as a warning to immediately withdraw from the area. This was the enemy essentially ceding ground without fighting. It was an acknowledgement that the price of engaging Australian SAS was too high, that the casualty ratios were so unfavorable that contact should be avoided at any cost. For a military force that had successfully fought the French, that was bleeding the American superpower through attrition, this was remarkable. They weren't afraid of American firepower. They had learned to counter it, to hide from it, to wait it out. But they were afraid of small teams of Australians with rifles and patience. Yet despite this unprecedented effectiveness, despite achieving results that should have revolutionized Western military thinking, the Australian SAS methods were never truly adopted by the American military. There were several reasons for this, some practical, some cultural, some political. The practical reason was scale. Australia deployed approximately 8,000 soldiers to Vietnam over the course of the war. The United States deployed 2.7 million. The Australian model required intense selection, extensive training, and a command culture that trusted small unit leaders to make life and death decisions without oversight. This was feasible for a small professional force. It was impossible for a conscript army measured in millions. You couldn't apply SAS selection standards to American recruitment. You would reject 90% of candidates and not have enough soldiers to meet commitments. You couldn't give American junior officers the autonomy of Australian patrol commanders. The organizational structure didn't support it. The training didn't prepare them for it, and the cultural expectations of both superiors and subordinates made it impossible. The American military was a machine designed for industrial warfare. for mobilizing the productive capacity of a continent and translating it into battlefield dominance. It was magnificent at what it did. But what it did was fundamentally different from what the Australians did. The cultural reason went deeper. American military culture valued systems over individuals, process over initiative, standardization over adaptation. This wasn't a flaw. It was what allowed the United States to field effective military forces on multiple continents simultaneously, to maintain complex logistical networks spanning oceans, to coordinate operations involving thousands of aircraft and millions of tons of supplies. But it created a military that was profoundly uncomfortable with the Australian approach. When an Australian patrol disappeared into the jungle for 2 weeks with no radio contact, their commanders trusted they were accomplishing the mission. When an American patrol went silent for 2 hours, commanders launched search and rescue operations. This wasn't because American soldiers were less capable. It was because the system was designed to control and coordinate, not to trust and enable. You couldn't simply tell American commanders to adopt Australian methods. It would require rebuilding the entire organizational culture from the ground up. The political reason was perhaps the most significant. Acknowledging that the Australian approach was superior would require admitting that the American approach, the approach that had consumed billions of dollars, deployed millions of soldiers, and dropped more bombs than were used in all of World War II, was flawed. It would raise uncomfortable questions about whether the war could have been fought more effectively, whether casualties could have been reduced, whether different training and tactics might have achieved better results. These weren't questions the Pentagon wanted to answer in 1968, with protests escalating, with public support collapsing, with the entire American strategy in Vietnam under siege. So the Australian success story was noted, studied, and quietly filed away. There were a few congressional inquiries about Allied combat effectiveness. Some training manuals were updated, but the fundamental lessons that quality mattered more than quantity, that firepower couldn't replace fieldcraft, that trust and autonomy produced better results than control and coordination, were never truly absorbed. The symbolism of the teabag took on deeper meaning as the war progressed. While American soldiers opened canned rations and complained about the food, Australian patrols brewed their tea and made do with whatever they could supplement from the jungle fish from streams, fruit from trees, rice taken from enemy supply caches. They carried less and lasted longer. While American units relied on daily helicopter resupply, Australian patrols could remain self-sufficient for weeks at a time. While American soldiers counted the days until their rotation home, Australian soldiers extended their tours because the work wasn't finished. This wasn't because Australians were tougher or more dedicated. It was because they had been selected and trained for exactly this type of warfare, while Americans had been drafted and trained for conventional combat in Europe. The difference showed in every metric that mattered. Australian forces in Phuoc province suffered approximately 1/3 the casualty rate of American forces in comparable terrain, while inflicting approximately 3 times the casualties on the enemy. These numbers weren't classified. They were in official reports, available to anyone who cared to look. But they told a story that undermined the entire American strategy. So they were discussed quietly and forgotten quickly. In September 1968. Something happened that crystallized everything the Australians represented and everything the Americans had failed to understand. A 6-man SAS patrol was compromised by a North Vietnamese company near the Songai River. The enemy force was approximately 150 soldiers, well-armed and professionally led. By doctrine, the patrol should have broken contact and withdrawn to a landing zone for extraction. Instead, they attacked. Using the terrain a steep ravine with dense vegetation on both sides, they established a series of ambush positions and systematically engaged the enemy force in a running battle that lasted 3 hours. When helicopter gunships finally arrived to provide support, the battle was already over. The Australians had killed or wounded 87 enemy soldiers. They had suffered 2 wounds, neither seriously. They had expended approximately 400 rounds of ammunition. When the patrol leader was asked why he hadn't withdrawn, his response entered Australian military legend: "Because they needed killing, and we were there to do it." This wasn't bravado. It was a statement of professional identity. These were soldiers who had been trained to solve problems, not to avoid them. The problem was an enemy force threatening Allied operations. The solution was to destroy it. The fact that they were outnumbered 25-1 was simply a factor to consider, not a reason to avoid engagement. American officers who studied the engagement couldn't comprehend the decision-making process. The risk analysis alone should have resulted in withdrawal. The patrol had no fire support, limited ammunition, and no possibility of reinforcement. By every principle of sound tactics, they should have disengaged. But they didn't because they had been trained under a different philosophy. Risk wasn't just about the probability of casualties. Risk was also about opportunity cost, about mission accomplishment, about the broader strategic impact of allowing a large enemy force to operate unmolested. The Australian patrol leader had made a judgment call. We can win this fight with acceptable casualties and significant impact on enemy operations. He was right. That judgment, that willingness to make life-and-death decisions based on assessment rather than doctrine, based on trust in his own skills and those of his team rather than waiting for higher approval, was what separated the SAS from conventional forces. It was what made them lethal beyond their numbers. And it was what the American military, with all its resources and technology, couldn't replicate because it required trusting junior officers and enlisted soldiers to make decisions that generals were uncomfortable delegating. The withdrawal of Australian forces began in 1970, not because they had failed, but because Australian public opinion had turned against the war. The SAS squadron departed in November 1971, having achieved a combat record unmatched by any Allied unit in Vietnam. Their final statistics were classified for years, not for security reasons, but because they were embarrassing to American forces. In 5 years of operations, the Australian SAS had conducted over 1,200 patrols. They had engaged the enemy in approximately 350 contacts. They had suffered 7 killed in action. They had killed approximately 2,300 enemy soldiers, confirmed kills, not estimates. That's a kill ratio of 328-1, even accounting for wounded. Even assuming perfect enemy casualty reporting, which was certainly not the case. The ratio remained above 150-1. These numbers weren't just good. They were anomalous to the point that military statisticians assumed the reporting methodology was flawed. But it wasn't. The Australians simply achieved what rigorous selection, intensive training, and operational autonomy made possible. Years later, after the war ended and the analysis began, some American officers acknowledged what they had witnessed. General Harold K. Johnson, Army Chief of Staff from 1964 to 1968, wrote in his memoirs that the Australian SAS demonstrated that our entire approach to counterinsurgency warfare may have been fundamentally flawed. They achieved more with the squadron than we achieved with divisions, and they did it by trusting their soldiers rather than controlling them. It was a remarkable admission from a man who had overseen the massive American buildup in Vietnam. But it came too late to influence policy, too late to save lives, too late to change outcomes. The lessons the Australians had tried to teach, that individual skill mattered more than collective firepower, that patience was more lethal than aggression, that less could be more, remained unlearned by the institution that most needed to learn them. The legacy of those schoolgirls and their short shorts and floppy hats extended far beyond Vietnam. The Australian SAS became the model for elite units worldwide. Their selection and training methodology studied and copied by special operations forces from Britain to Israel to New Zealand. But the deeper lesson, that trust and autonomy could produce results that control and firepower could not remain controversial. Military institutions are built on hierarchy and standardization. The Australian approach challenged both. It suggested that the solution to complex military problems wasn't better technology or more resources, but better people given freedom to operate. This was a threatening idea to large military bureaucracies. And it remains so today. The North Vietnamese eventually won the war. Not because they defeated Australian forces in the field. They never did. But because they outlasted American political will. The Australians departed, the Americans withdrew, and South Vietnam fell in 1975. But in the prison camps of North Vietnam, in the military academies where the victors taught the next generation, the Australian SAS remained a subject of intense study. They had demonstrated something that contradicted Maoist guerrilla doctrine, that a small, highly skilled conventional force could dominate a guerrilla war if it abandoned conventional methods. The Vietnamese had learned to fight the Americans by exploiting their predictability. They never learned to fight the Australians because unpredictability, skill, and initiative can't be countered with tactics. They can only be matched with equivalent skill, and that takes years of selection and training that guerrilla forces rarely possess. American captain who had mocked the Australians in 1966 returned home in 1969 with a silver star and 2 Purple Hearts. He went on to a successful military career, eventually retiring as a brigadier general. In his retirement speech in 1988, he told a story about Vietnam that his audience didn't fully understand. "I once laughed at soldiers who looked like schoolgirls," he said. "They were wearing short shorts and floppy hats, and they looked like they were going on a camping trip, not a combat operation. I thought I knew what warriors looked like. I was wrong. Those men taught me that appearance means nothing, that equipment means nothing, that all the firepower in the world means nothing if you don't have skill and courage and the wisdom to know when to fight and when to wait. They were the finest soldiers I ever served with, and I spent the rest of my career trying to understand what made them that way." He never quite figured it out, not because it was complicated, but because it was simple in a way that contradicted everything his training had taught him. The Australians were better because they trusted their men, because they selected ruthlessly, because they trained patiently, and because they allowed their soldiers to be warriors rather than components in a machine. That was the lesson. That was what the teabags symbolized, what the kill ratios proved, what the enemy's fear confirmed. Small numbers of exceptional people, properly trained and wisely led, can achieve the impossible. In the Australian War Memorial in Canberra, there's a small plaque commemorating the SAS service in Vietnam. It lists the names of the fallen, all 7 of them. Beneath the names is a quote from an unknown North Vietnamese commander, captured in a document recovered in 1970. "When fighting the Americans, we learn their schedule and avoid their strength. When fighting the Australians, we pray they do not find us, because if they do, we die." This wasn't propaganda. It wasn't an exaggeration. It was the testimony of an enemy who had learned, through brutal experience, that some opponents can't be outfought, only avoided. The Americans brought firepower, resources, and technology. The Australians brought something that couldn't be measured in tons of bombs or millions of bullets. Competence raised to the level of art. Professionalism refined to the point of lethality. And the quiet confidence of men who knew exactly how dangerous they were. The jungle has reclaimed most of the patrol routes now. The rubber plantations have grown wild. The fire bases have dissolved into the red earth. But the lessons remain, waiting for military institutions willing to learn them. That skill matters more than scale. That trust produces better results than control. That a small number of people given autonomy and proper preparation can achieve what entire divisions cannot. These truths haven't changed. They won't change. They are fundamental to human conflict, proven over and over across history. From the Spartans at Thermopylae, to the Finnish soldiers of the Winter War, to those Australian soldiers in their shorts and floppy hats, brewing tea in the jungle and hunting an enemy that had learned to fear them. The real question isn't whether these lessons are true. The real question is whether military institutions have the courage to act on them, to abandon the comfort of industrial-scale solutions and embrace the harder truth that in certain types of warfare, nothing matters more than the quality of the individual soldier and the wisdom to let that soldier do what he was trained to do. The Australians understood this. They proved it. They tried to teach it. Whether anyone was listening remains an open question.